So now we're going to continue with the cardiovascular system, and we're going to take a look at our blood circulation. So this is related to the heart still. And the first definition is artery. So the first artery we have taken a look at is the aorta. Remember, that's the really large artery that's coming off of our left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, it pushes blood into the aorta. And so an artery is a vessel that carries blood away from the heart. Carries blood away from the heart. So an artery is something that carries blood, is a vessel that's carrying blood away from the heart. So the heart is squeezing, contracting, and carries away from the heart. The other is a vein. And so then the vein would be the opposite. This is a vessel that carries blood toward the heart. Now this is where I want to be very, very clear. When we're looking at diagrams of the heart, or when we're looking at images of a heart, models of hearts, oftentimes we see different vessels and different chambers that are colored either red or blue. Now when we see red, so any vessel that's colored red, this indicates that the blood is oxygenated. Now this does not necessarily mean that it is an artery. Okay, so this is very clear because there are pulmonary veins that are colored red because they are carrying oxygenated blood. So a vessel that is carrying oxygenated blood, so for example our aorta is carrying oxygenated blood, oxygenated meaning that it's filled up with oxygen, but we also have our pulmonary veins. So the aorta is an artery, and it is red because it's carrying oxygenated blood. And our pulmonary veins are veins, and they're also red because they're carrying oxygenated blood. On the other hand, when we see these vessels that are blue, these are carrying deoxygenated, blood. Meaning blood that has less oxygen, de-oxygen, taken away of the oxygen. So we have now dropped oxygen off at the tissues in the body, and then now that blood is coming back to get oxygenated. So again, sometimes we assume that that means that those are always veins, but that's not necessarily the case. So in the case of our pulmonary trunk, our pulmonary trunk has deoxygenated blood, but it's leaving the heart. It's leaving the heart to go into the lungs. We also have our superior and inferior vena cava, or cava. So these are both bringing blood to the heart. So remember, the superior and inferior vena cava are both bringing blood into our right atrium, coming to the heart, and our pulmonary trunk is carrying blood away from the heart into the lungs. So one is going toward the heart and the other is going away from the heart, but they're both carrying deoxygenated blood. So assuming that red means artery and blue means vein is an incorrect assumption. It's based on whether or not they have oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood. So as we're moving through this, keep that in mind. Also, when we're talking about arteries and veins, let's take a look at the different kind of sizes of arteries and veins. When we're talking about arteries, we're talking about our largest blood vessels. Our largest blood vessels, they also have the thickest, strongest walls of blood vessels. And we'll take a closer look at that when we look at blood vessels. But for just a moment, before we move into our blood circulation, we'll look at kind of the different types of vessels. So we have our arteries, and then our blood is going to be flowing through the arteries, which are big and thick. Thick, and they're big, they're strong. Then the blood will be flowing into what are called arterioles. So arterioles are still rather large, but they're not as large as the arteries. They're also not as strong. Then we're going to have the blood go from our arteries to our arterioles to our capillaries. Now our capillaries are very, very important. This is where we have our exchange. So our exchange with the tissues. These are very, very small vessels. They're single cell walls, meaning that they have the thickness of single cells. And some capillaries actually are made up of one single cell that's wrapped around in a tube shape. So it's one single cell, it's got its nucleus in here, and then the blood is flowing through this area in here. And it's just one single cell, very, very thin, allows for very easy exchange between the blood and the tissue that's surrounding it. So then we move from capillaries, which is where we actually have our exchange, where we'll be talking about this in a lot more detail. And then we move into what are called venules. So venules, similar to arterioles, are veins that are kind of medium sized. Let's say our arterioles are medium sized, our venules are medium sized. So at this point what we're doing is we're moving now our deoxygenated blood. So if we'd start out our arteries here are, let's say, oxygenated, moving from the heart, then arterioles. Then when we get to the capillaries, we're exchanging. So we have some capillaries when the blood's coming in, we have lots of oxygen, so it's oxygenated, then we're going to have that exchange. And then we have our deoxygenated, then our venules are going to be mostly deoxygenated, and then we get to our larger vessels that are carrying deoxygenated blood, typically, which are our veins. And so these are a little bit larger. And so we're going to talk again about this, like I said, when we get to our blood vessels section. But I wanted to talk about this now just a little bit because now what we're going to be doing is looking at our different blood circulation systems here, our circuits. So here you can see in this image in the upper right-hand corner, up here, we have our heart, again, red, meaning carries oxygenated blood, blue, deoxygenated blood. So we're going to take a look at how blood is flowing through the heart and flowing through the body. So we have two different circuits here. We have what's called the pulmonary circuit, and we have the systemic circuit. You can probably guess pulmonary circuit. This is where we have our exchange with the lungs. Pulmonary meaning lungs. So this is where we move our blood from the heart to the lungs. We have an exchange between the heart and the lungs. Our systemic circuit, as it implies, is going to the rest of the systems, so throughout the rest of the body. So our systemic circuit is going to be moving throughout the rest of the systems, so going throughout the rest of the body, so between the heart and everywhere else except the lungs. All right, so the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. So if we look at this image on the left-hand side here, you can see here that if we're looking at the heart in the center, this kind of part here, right, you can see, is actually our pulmonary circuit. So you can see that we're going into the left lung here and the right lung over here. So this is our pulmonary circuit. Then we have the up and down here. This is the systemic circuit, so going out to the rest of the systems. So our pulmonary circuit, right, includes where we're coming in from our inferior vena cava, right here, and superior vena cava into our right atrium, and then moves down into the right ventricle, then goes up through the pulmonary trunk, and then we're going to split off into the left and the right, going to the lungs. So this is our pulmonary circuit. And then we're going to go in the lungs, and you can see here that it changes from blue, from our deoxygenated blood, into our oxygenated blood, because as we're in the lungs, we're picking up oxygen. So our oxygenated blood is then going to go from the lungs through, right here, our pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins going into our left atrium, then going from our left atrium down into our left ventricle, And then we're going to go into our systemic circuit. And our systemic circuit is then going to be pushing the blood from our left ventricle out through the aorta up here, which is going down here to the bottom part of the body and up here to the top part of the body as it's related to the heart, so inferiorly and superiorly. So then this is our systemic circuit. So then as we go here, we're moving into our arterioles, moving into our capillaries, where we have an exchange between the blood and the tissues. So going from oxygenated red blood to deoxygenated blue blood, which in real life there is no such thing as the blue blood. All of our blood is red. But for illustration purposes, that's how we indicate where we have that exchange. So then our blue blood is going to come up from the systemic circuit, go into our inferior vena cava. Up here, we have the exchange, go into the superior vena cava, into the right atrium, and then we're moving back into our pulmonary circuit, going to the lungs. So I did want to take just a moment to kind of write out this entire process. So if we're talking about how the blood is going to flow through the heart chambers and the valves, this is an important part that you understand how this works, and then we're going to look at how this works with the conduction system, meaning the electrical system. So when we're moving blood, the blood circulation, we're going to start with the superior and inferior vena cava. So if we look at our heart image up here, we have our superior vena cava and we have our inferior vena cava. And so remember, the blood is coming up from inferior to the heart and coming from superior to the heart. And you can see that these are the holes here for the tube, the vena cava, and the blood's coming up into the right atrium, right? So blood from the entire system, all of the body, all the systems is coming up through the inferior and superior vena cava. They're then going to bring the blood up into the right atrium. So then we're in the right atrium, then it's going to flow through, what is this valve here? Right, the tricuspid valve. So our tricuspid valve, remember this is our atrioventricular valve. So it flows through the tricuspid valve into our right ventricle. So then we're in the right ventricle, the blood's in the right ventricle. Then it's going to contract, it's going to be pushed up through, what's this valve? Our pulmonary semilunar valve, and the blood will then flow into our pulmonary trunk. Then when it goes into the pulmonary trunk, it's going to go into our pulmonary arteries. So it's going to go into the left pulmonary arteries, so we get to our left lung, and it's going to split off into, going behind here, the right pulmonary arteries going into the right lung. So we are in the pulmonary arteries. Then when we get into the lungs, remember the name of the tubes, the vessels that are having that exchange, right, that's the capillaries. So the capillaries in the lungs. So or the capillary network within the lungs. So we're in the capillaries in the lungs. Then we're going to go from the capillaries, we've dropped off carbon dioxide, picked up oxygen, and now we're going to come back from the lungs via our left pulmonary veins, right here, so left pulmonary veins, and then back here they have it illustrated, our right pulmonary veins coming from the right lung, and they are both going to be dropping blood into our left atrium. So now we're in the left atrium. We're going to allow the blood to flow down through, what is this valve called? Right, our bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve. Then we're going to have the blood in our left ventricle. Then from the left ventricle, it's going to be forced out through this valve, which is called what? The aortic semilunar valve. Right, so it goes through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. Right, so then once it's in the aorta, then it's going to go to our systemic circulation. All right, we're going to the system. So when that happens, we're going from the aorta, and then we'll say to our systemic arteries. So our systemic arteries, and then once we go to our systemic arteries, then we're going to get to those little tiny vessels where we have the exchange, our systemic capillaries. So we have that exchange at our systemic capillaries, or system capillaries. Then we're going to go to our systemic or system veins. I kind of skipped over venules. There are venules in there, but we're doing generalization. So our systemic veins. And then once we go to our systemic veins, here we are at the great vessels. So our inferior vena cava and our superior vena cava. So you should know all of these steps here. So starting at the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, you should be able to walk through all of those steps. All of the blood flows through the heart, including kind of the systemic arteries, systemic capillaries, systemic veins, getting back up to the inferior and superior vena cava. So these are our, this is our blood circulation to get our blood into the lungs, to get it oxygenated, and then get it to all of the rest of the body. Now this, however, does not include blood flow to the heart itself. So that is something separate. So when we're talking about blood flow here, we talked about the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit, but that does not talk about circulation for the heart. Circulation for the heart is called coronary circulation. So coronary circulation is actually part of the systemic circuit. Now, we didn't talk about it in the systemic circuit because we were more concerned with getting out to all of the tissues, but one of those tissues is actually the heart itself. Now, when we talk about the heart pumping blood, the blood that's actually in the chambers, once the blood goes into the atria and then the blood goes into the ventricle, that's not actually nourishing that myocardium. It's not nourishing the heart itself. So it has its own circulatory system. So its own circulatory system includes the coronary arteries. And these coronary arteries branch from the aorta to supply the heart muscle itself with oxygenated blood. So from the aorta. So again, part of the system, because we're going out the aorta, and then that blood is going to be coming from the aorta into the coronary arteries, and then supply the heart itself, the heart muscle, with the oxygenated blood. Then we have this network of little tiny capillaries that are covering the surface of the heart. Then we have our cardiac veins. And our cardiac veins are going to be draining the myocardium from blood. Or of blood. So we get blood from the aorta, and it feeds into, or it's going to supply the myocardium. So from aorta, supplies the myocardium. And then our cardiac veins are going to drain the myocardium of blood because we have the same thing happening, right? We're getting oxygen to the actual cardiac cells, the cardiocytes, and then we're going to take away carbon dioxide and drain that. Now, there's one other part of this that you should be aware of called the coronary sinus. Now, the coronary sinus is a large vein on the posterior of the heart. And this receives blood from the cardiac veins. So our cardiac veins are going to all kind of culminate in the coronary sinus. So a large vein on posterior of heart. And this is where the cardiac veins are draining. So then the blood is going to empty into the right atrium. via the coronary sinus. So if we're talking about our coronary circulation, right, getting blood to the heart, what we see then is it's going to be going from the aorta to the coronary arteries that are feeding the actual heart itself, the myocardium. Then once that exchange has happened, then we go to our cardiac veins, which drain into our coronary sinus, which then drains into our right atrium. And then if we take a look at the oxygenation here, our aorta is going to have oxygenated blood. The coronary arteries have oxygenated blood. And then this is kind of where we have that exchange. Oops, cardiac. Then we have the cardiac veins are going to have deoxygenated blood because this is where we've had the exchange. Let's see, half red, half blue. And then our coronary sinus is where we have all of our cardiac veins coming together, large vessel, and then dropping into our right atrium, which is meeting up with, again, our superior and inferior vena cava coming from the rest of the body. So one last thing I'd like to talk about really quickly, because we are talking about coronary circulation, are heart attacks. Also called myocardial infarctions. So a myocardial infarction, as you can tell in the name, myocardial, meaning that myocardium, or the heart itself, so the tissue of the heart. So a heart attack is when we have a lack of blood flow through a coronary artery. So let's write that down. So lack of blood flow. All right, lack of blood flow through a coronary artery. So remember, the coronary artery is what's feeding the myocardium, the heart itself, of oxygenated blood. So then what this causes is starvation and death of myocardium. All right, so starvation, meaning that it's not getting oxygen. So if we think about a blood vessel, right, so this is, let's say, our coronary artery. Now, if we get into a situation where this starts to not bring blood to the heart, so let's say the heart's over here, right? Well, that doesn't really make much sense now, does it? Because the coronary artery is on the heart. But let's just say this is our heart, and it's bringing blood to the heart from what's over here, right, the aorta. All right, so what we have here, this is often caused by something called atherosclerosis. So atherosclerosis is a hardening of an artery wall. And this can be due to plaque formation. Okay, so what we can see happening, and we won't get into too much detail, it can be due to a calcium plaque formation. It can be due to, this can start as a high blood pressure situation. So when we have high blood pressure, too much pressure in our blood, what that causes is it causes damage to blood vessels. So if you think of something that has too much pressure in it, it's pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. When it does that, then what can happen is these arteries can then be starting to be damaged in various ways. One of the ways it can be damaged is by roughening up the surface of these arteries. And then when that happens, little things start to stick to them. Oftentimes we've got little platelets that start to stick, which we'll talk about in more detail later. But we have platelets, which are really sticky guys. It'll start to stick there. And then when that happens, they start to harden. They get stuck, and then as they get more and more and more stuck, then they start to fill in. You can see as they're getting more stuck because the little tiny platelets are sticky, and then they stick more and more and more as blood's flowing through here. And then we start to harden, and then they stick, and then they harden, and then the next thing you know it, we've filled up a vessel here with this plaque. And so now the blood's not able to get through because all of this stuff is hardened in this area. So we have this hardening of the artery wall and then this plaque formation. And so then this narrows the coronary artery. So let's say before I completely filled it in, first of all, we'd be still getting some blood through here, but not enough blood, likely. So then it narrows this coronary artery. And the narrowing of the coronary artery is then going to not bring enough oxygen to those cells and can cause death of the cells. Now there is an additional complication here, and that is related to thrombosis and embolism. So when we're talking about these, a thrombosis is actually a blood clot. So this is a blood clot that can form anywhere in the body, and it can cause obstruction of a vessel. And when this happens, it can happen, say, in an artery in the liver, or in the kidneys, or in some other location, and this is a thrombus. So thrombosis is the condition of the formation of a blood clot. So the blood clot itself is a thrombus. And so this can stop blood flow to an area. So it can stop blood flow to a particular part of the intestine, for example, and then that part of the intestine may die, but the rest of the intestine is still working and functioning. Now what can happen is that we have this blood clot, this thrombus, and part of it or all of it can break free depending on where it is, where its location is. When this happens, this is called now an embolus. An embolism, I guess I should do that backwards here. So an embolism is now the medical condition when part of that blood clot detaches itself, or the whole thing, and then moves to another site. So part or whole blood clot breaks free and moves to other location. So then this is called an embolus. So now this embolus is moving freely throughout the body. And then when we have a situation like this coronary artery that now has this very, very narrow area where the blood is flowing through, then this embolus can then be coming right along, and as it comes right along, it can get stuck right here, and it can stop the blood flow completely to the myocardium. And then when that happens, then we have death of the myocardium. It's no longer contracting, no longer pumping blood, and so we have a myocardial infarction.